The USDA inspector revoked my organic status, so I filed the obscure 1938 Price Stabilization Act and triggered a $70 million subsidy clawback. The legacy and the lie. The blood and the soil. My name is Ben Carter, and I am a man who always smelled of earth, not corporate exhaust. I am the fourth-generation steward of Ironwood Creek Farm. We don't just grow food here, we cultivate a legacy. For nearly a century, this land has sustained our family, and we have, in turn, sustained the soil. When I trace the stones of our oldest foundation, I feel the grit of my great-grandfather, Samuel Carter, who secured this farm during the worst years of the 1920s Dust Bowl, not just saving it, but transforming it into a beacon of sustainable agriculture. Ironwood Creek Farm is not a conventional operation. It is certified organic. This designation isn't just a marketing label. It is the verifiable result of sweat, discipline, and absolute adherence to every rule set forth by the USDA National Organic Program, NOP. Our seeds are heirloom varieties handed down through generations. Our water flows from a pristine natural spring, and our soil teems with the microorganisms far superior to any factory-produced fertilizer. That organic tag was our identity, our integrity, and, most crucially, our entire market access. High-end metropolitan chefs, farm-to-table cooperatives, and every loyal customer who valued purity bought our crops based on that label alone. Lose the label, and our entire business model collapses. And that was precisely what the corporation next door intended. The industrial Goliath. 2 years ago, AgriCorp, the industrial Goliath, rolled into our valley. They purchased 10,000 acres surrounding our property in a single, massive transaction. Their philosophy was the antithesis of ours. Their focus was pure monoculture, genetically modified corn, treated with chemicals that viewed the soil as a disposable medium. They employed no crop rotation, instituted zero measures for topsoil preservation, and showed no regard for the native habitat. The massive chemical tankers that rumbled past our driveway weren't just transporting product. They were delivering the smell of ecological arrogance. AgriCorp's goal was never just to farm. It was to dominate the entire regional market, and they could not tolerate a small, successful model like Ironwood Creek Farm existing on the fringes, quietly proving that their industrial scale was not the only way. To execute their dirty work, they acquired a tool, Inspector Greg Wallace. Wallace was a mid-level bureaucrat within the USDA's Agricultural Marketing Service, AMS, the kind of man who wore an unnecessary tie on a dusty farm road. He wasn't guided by agricultural science. He was guided by corporate convenience. AgriCorp had his ear, and his mission was clearly to use the very regulations designed to protect integrity as a weapon against it. When I filed my initial complaints about pesticide drift, Wallace consistently ran interference for AgriCorp, skillfully twisting the rules to ensure that the burden of compliance fell unfairly on me. The buffer zone battlefield. The core of our conflict lay in the buffer zone. This sacred boundary is required by NOP rules to separate organic and conventional fields, preventing contamination from chemical drift or runoff. Regulations mandate a minimum of 75 feet. We had always exceeded this. We maintained a 100-foot natural windbreak of native prairie grasses and shrubbery, a living, breathing wall that blocked drift and conserved our topsoil, a testament to my family's long-term stewardship. But when AgriCorp initiated its relentless monoculture operation, their aerial pesticide application was so widespread that my windbreak couldn't withstand the pressure. Our crop lab reports began showing, for the first time, trace amounts of conventional pesticide residue. Though harmless to consumers, the presence of any unapproved substance is, under NOP guidelines, a death sentence for certified organic status. I showed Greg Wallace the evidence, wind pattern reports, drift analysis, and clear documentation of AgriCorp's excessive spraying schedules. Wallace dismissed it all with the cold finality of federal paperwork. "Mr. Carter," he declared, his voice carrying the bureaucratic authority he loved to wield, "the Organic Act is clear. The responsibility of maintaining organic integrity lies solely with the certified operation. If your buffer zone is insufficient to mitigate the drift, then the fault lies with you. Perhaps you require a 200-foot buffer zone." 200 feet. I shot back, my voice tight with indignation. That's a significant percentage of my arable land. Why won't AgriCorp mitigate their spraying? Their practices are a clear threat to regional resource integrity. Their operation falls under USDA commodity stabilization payments, Mr. Carter. Their compliance is managed by a different office, Wallace replied, shuffling his clipboard. My office handles organic integrity, and you are, at this moment, non-compliant. Over the next 2 months, Wallace, acting in concert with AgriCorp's lawyers, waged a war of attrition. Every week brought a new audit and a fresh violation notice. My records were spotless, but their agenda was simple. They cited me for inadequate soil health management, and even the aesthetic non-compliance of my great-grandfather's 1920s irrigation structure. Every minor penalty was merely an act of intimidation, designed to drain my resources and my will. Knowledge nugget number 1. The operator's burden. In organic certification disputes, the NOP places the sole burden of proof and protection on the certified operator, not the contaminating source. This legal asymmetry often allows large, non-organic operations to use chemical drift as a cheap, effective weapon to force out smaller competitors, all while remaining compliant with their own, less strict, conventional regulations. The final hammer blow. 9 minutes and 40 seconds. Then came the day of the final reckoning. It was a cold Tuesday morning when Greg Wallace, flanked by 2 anonymous USDA legal advisors, walked straight into my barn office. The official weight of the large manila envelope he carried felt like a stone in my stomach, a fear I had been bracing against for months. Mr. Carter, Wallace stated, devoid of any professional compassion. This is the final ruling from the AMS Organic Standards Board. Due to persistent cross-contamination and your failure to implement viable remedial measures, Ironwood Creek Farm's certified organic status is hereby revoked, effective immediately. Revoked? But our appeals, our new soil tests. The appeals were denied, Mr. Carter. The science is conclusive on the presence of unapproved substances. The fault lies with the operator, he reiterated, emphasizing the corporate talking point. He handed me a fact sheet with the grim pronouncement, reapplication for certification may be considered after a mandatory 3-year conventional farming period. 3 years. 3 years of conventional farming meant dousing my hallowed ground in chemicals, destroying a century of soil health, and alienating my entire loyal buyer base. That 3-year gap was a guaranteed sentence of bankruptcy. AgriCorp's plan was complete. They would wait until I was desperate, then swoop in and buy my valuable creekfront land for cents on the dollar. The revocation document wasn't just a piece of paper. It was Greg Wallace's triumphant seal on 4 generations of my family's work. As he and his team strode out, casting a glance towards the endless acres of AgriCorp's massive corn operation, their faces held the firm conviction that the war was over. The defiant resolve. The silence in the barn was thick with the scent of defeat. My wife, Sarah, came to me, her eyes clouded with tears. What do we do now, Ben? Our market, our name, it's all gone. I placed the revocation notice on the workbench, running my fingers over the familiar grime of the wood. We do what the Carter family has always done. We fight. But they have the USDA. They have a battalion of lawyers. They read the USDA's latest memos, Sarah. I'm going to read the USDA's history. The frustration that had been choking me hardened into an absolute resolve. Wallace thought he could break me with petty Organic Act rules and modern, lobbyist-influenced regulations. But he forgot that the USDA is more than just the Organic Act. The USDA's foundation was laid in the crucible of the Civil War and the Great Depression. Back then, laws were created not for corporate profit, but for the absolute protection of the soil and the survival of the small farmer. And those laws are still alive, buried in the dusty archives, ignored by men like Greg Wallace who think only the newest regulation matters. I looked toward the corner of my office, where my great-grandfather's farm ledgers and ancient government circulars were stacked high. Their smell was of dry paper and dust, but to me, they suddenly smelled like justice. Wallace and Thorne thought they defeated a farmer. But they picked a fight with a man who understands soil mechanics. I understand water rights. And most importantly, I leaned in, my voice low and fierce. I understand the law they think they've outgrown. The Dust Bowl era weapon, Dust Bowl Yug Ka Hatia. The buried truth. The revocation of my organic certification was meant to be the end. For Greg Wallace and AgriCorp, it was a tidy victory. Another small farmer crushed under the weight of modern regulations designed to favor industrial agriculture. But for me, Ben Carter, it was a declaration of war, and I wasn't about to fight with their weapons. While Wallace likely celebrated by pushing more paperwork and AgriCorp planned their inevitable land acquisition, I was already retreating to my war room, the dusty, chaotic archive of Ironwood Creek Farm's history. My farm office, usually a place for seed catalogs and harvest schedules, transformed into a research bunker. I didn't just have boxes. I had entire wooden crates filled with documents accumulated over a century. Every deed, every permit, every government circular from Samuel Carter's time during the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl was meticulously preserved. This wasn't mere sentimentality. My great-grandfather, a pragmatist and a survivor, understood the power of paperwork. He had foreseen future battles, perhaps not against chemical giants, but certainly against bureaucratic indifference and economic pressure. I pored over faded maps, deciphering hand-drawn irrigation schematics and reading through dense, archaic legal language. I wasn't looking for organic loopholes. I was looking for the original, foundational principles upon which the United States Department of Agriculture, USDA, was built. The Organic Foods Production Act, OFPA, the very law Wallace used against me, was a relatively recent creation, a mere blip in the USDA's long history. But the USDA itself? It was forged in crisis. Knowledge nugget number 3, the USDA's foundational mandate. The USDA, established in 1862 during the Civil War, gained significant power and responsibility during the Great Depression and Dust Bowl eras. Its initial mandate extended far beyond food production. It was tasked with preserving national resources, stabilizing farm economies, and ensuring long-term ecological security. Many powerful, often forgotten, statutes from this period carry mandatory, non-discretionary penalties for violations, especially concerning land stewardship. These are the nuclear options in the Federal Register. I focused my search on the period of my great-grandfather's most intense activism, the 1930s. This was a time when the nation was literally losing its topsoil to wind and greed, and farmers faced ruin. Congress enacted sweeping legislation to protect both the land and the farmer. I searched for anything related to soil conservation, resource stabilization, economic security, and critically, mandatory federal payments. AgriCorp, I knew, received massive subsidies. If those subsidies were tied to historical, ironclad land stewardship requirements, I might have a chance. Days blurred into nights. The smell of stale coffee mingled with the dry, papery scent of old documents. I tracked down specific congressional records, cross-referencing them with my great-grandfather's personal notes. He had been a vocal proponent of early soil conservation efforts, even testifying before state agricultural committees. In one of his journals, tucked between notes on crop rotation and rainfall, I found a handwritten reference, the Price Act, Section 4B, mandatory clawback for resource misuse. The Price Act. The name didn't immediately ring a bell from modern legal databases. This was it. This was the obscure weapon. The Rediscovery, 1938 Price Stabilization and Regional Resource Act. The 1938 Price Stabilization and Regional Resource Act. It sounded like something only a historian or an antiquarian lawyer would ever encounter. The act was a direct response to the ecological catastrophe of the Dust Bowl and the economic depression gripping rural America. Its primary goals were ambitious: to prevent future environmental devastation, stabilize commodity prices, and ensure the long-term viability of American agriculture. I found the original printed copy in a university law library, a massive, bound volume that smelled of forgotten knowledge. The language was dense, written in the formal, verbose style of pre-WWII legislation, but its intent was crystal clear. Section 4B, the specific part my great-grandfather had referenced, was a marvel of legal foresight. It explicitly stated that any agricultural operation receiving federal commodity stabilization payments was subject to a strict set of regional resource preservation standards. These standards were non-negotiable and covered topsoil retention, mandating practices that prevented wind and water erosion, water table stability, prohibiting practices that excessively depleted or contaminated regional groundwater and surface water, ecological diversity, encouraging a balance of native habitats to prevent widespread susceptibility to disease and pests. Crucially, the Act wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't about best practices. It was a mandatory condition for receiving federal funds. And the penalty? This was the gem. Section 4(b) stipulated a mandatory and immediate reimbursement of all federal commodity stabilization payments received since the date of initial violation. This wasn't a fine, it was a clawback. Every single dollar AgriCorp had received since they began their destructive monoculture practices could be demanded back. AgriCorp was a behemoth precisely because of these subsidies. They received over $12 million annually in corn stabilization payments, a crucial pillar of their financial model. Over the past 6 years since they acquired the surrounding land, this amounted to nearly $70 million, a sum that would cripple even a corporation of their size. This wasn't about my organic status anymore. This was about their very existence. While Greg Wallace focused on my 100-foot buffer, AgriCorp was systematically violating a much older, far more powerful law with their thousands of acres of monoculture, their chemical runoff, and their blatant disregard for regional ecology. The pesticide drift was a petty theft. Their overall operation was a grand larceny against the land, and against federal law that had been quietly waiting to be invoked. The forensic counterattack. Armed with the knowledge of the 1938 Act, my fight shifted from defense to offense. I enlisted the help of an old friend, Dr. Lena Sharma, a retired environmental forensics expert from the State University. Lena was renowned for her ability to build airtight cases using scientific data. "Ben, this is fascinating," Lena said, poring over my copies of the 1938 Act. "Most lawyers wouldn't even know this exists. It's a gold mine." Our task was clear: to document AgriCorp's violations of the 1938 Act's resource preservation standards. This wasn't just about my small organic farm. It was about the cumulative impact of their 10,000 acres. We worked tirelessly, collecting data on soil erosion. We used satellite imagery and drone footage to demonstrate massive topsoil loss on AgriCorp's unprotected fields, particularly after heavy rains. We compared this to historical topographical maps, showing how their monoculture had drastically increased erosion rates compared to past, diversified farming practices. Water contamination. We conducted extensive water testing on the regional aquifer and tributary streams flowing through AgriCorp's land. The results were damning: high levels of nitrates and phosphates, direct evidence of chemical fertilizer runoff. This directly violated the Water Table Stability Clause of the 1938 Act. We even cross-referenced this with public health data, showing an uptick in nitrate levels in local drinking wells downstream from AgriCorp. Lack of ecological diversity. AgriCorp's fields were a sterile monoculture. They had systematically removed native windbreaks, hedgerows, and wetlands, all critical components for biodiversity and natural pest control, and indirect violations of the Act's spirit to maintain regional ecological health. While Lena and her team were building this forensic fortress, AgriCorp wasn't idle. They escalated their harassment, convinced that I was simply a bitter, defeated farmer. They sent their own inspectors, private security guards disguised as agricultural consultants, to trespass on my land, taking photos and attempting to find any new violations. They filed frivolous complaints with the county zoning board about my unsightly compost piles and my unregistered farm equipment. They were trying to exhaust me, to bleed me dry with legal fees. One particularly brazen incident involved a fake claim of a chemical spill on my land. A local news crew, clearly tipped off by AgriCorp, showed up, ready to film my ecological negligence. But I was ready. I had installed motion-activated cameras around my property. The footage clearly showed AgriCorp's security team dumping a small barrel of inert, non-toxic green liquid near my creek bed, then calling the authorities. The local sheriff, a decent man, saw the clear setup and dismissed the complaint, issuing AgriCorp a stern warning. This incident, however, served as a crucial piece of leverage. It wasn't just about their environmental violations. It was about their malicious intent and their willingness to fabricate evidence. This proved their bad faith and would be invaluable in court, showing their pattern of intimidation. The Achilles heel, the $70 million subsidies. The financial heart of AgriCorp was its reliance on federal subsidies. This wasn't just supplemental income, it was foundational. I hired a forensic accountant, an old college friend named Mark Jensen, to dig into AgriCorp's public financial records. AgriCorp was a publicly traded company, and their quarterly reports detailed their federal payments with painstaking accuracy. Mark confirmed my suspicions. AgriCorp was a heavy recipient of USDA commodity stabilization payments. Since their aggressive land acquisitions 6 years prior, they had received an average of $11.7 million annually in corn subsidies. The total, adjusted for minor variations, came to just over $70 million. This was their Achilles heel. The 1938 Act's clawback provision wasn't a negotiation, it was an absolute mandate. If a judge found that AgriCorp was in violation of the resource preservation standards, every penny of that $70 million would be subject to immediate reimbursement to the federal government. This wasn't a fine that could be absorbed. It was a reversal of their entire financial history in the region. It would plunge them into an insurmountable debt, destroy their credit lines, and likely lead to their bankruptcy. Greg Wallace, still sending me threatening letters about non-compliant fences, remained oblivious. He thought I was beaten, a small farmer defeated by the system. He had no idea that while he was trying to extinguish my small light, I was busy igniting a $70 million bomb under his corporate masters. My organic status was just a few rows of corn and beans. Their $70 million subsidy was the entire foundation of their industrial empire. The old law was not just a weapon. It was a precision-guided missile aimed straight at AgriCorp's financial heart. The boardroom showdown, Karyakari Paris had Ka Akri Samna. Escalation, the harassment campaign. Once AgriCorp realized I wasn't just going to pack up and sell, their initial bureaucratic annoyance morphed into a full-scale, malicious harassment campaign. They weren't dealing with a defeated organic farmer anymore. They were dealing with a technical adversary who had spent weeks digging up laws older than their company. But they didn't know which law. They only knew I was dangerous. Inspector Greg Wallace, now under increasing pressure from his superiors, and likely AgriCorp's legal team, doubled down on the petty regulations. He didn't have the authority to revoke my organic status, but he could make farming impossible. I received citations for improper fence height, unauthorized discharge of clean rainwater, and even a bizarre notice demanding the immediate removal of historically non-compliant agricultural aesthetic elements, a notice clearly targeting my great-grandfather's 1920s stone silo. Their goal was to flood my mailbox with fines and my lawyer with paperwork, forcing me to deplete my defense fund before I could execute my planned attack. They were playing a purely defensive game of exhaustion. Simultaneously, AgriCorp's CEO, Marcus Thorne, made his final, contemptuous offer. He arranged a meeting at a sterile, air-conditioned law office downtown, far from the soil. Thorne, a man who measured life in quarterly profits, arrived in a spotless suit, flanked by two corporate lawyers who looked ready to crush me with a single glance. "Mr. Carter," Thorne began, leaning back smugly, "I respect the fight. But your organic status is gone. Your property value has plummeted. We are offering you $300,000 over the current land appraisal. Take it. It's a generous exit strategy. You can retire, lick your wounds, and stop wasting your time fighting regulations that don't apply to a farm your size." I looked across the table, not at Thorne, but at his lead lawyer, who had a nervous twitch. They were terrified of something, but they didn't know what. "Mr. Thorne," I replied, keeping my voice steady, "I appreciate the offer. But my family has already decided not to sell. In fact, we've decided to expand. And before we expand, we need to ensure the regional resource stability is maintained, as required by law." Thorne scoffed. "Resource stability? I'm the biggest corn producer in the state. I am stability. You're talking nonsense. Sign the papers, Carter, or we will bury you in fines that your farm will never recover from." This meeting was the last chance for both sides to stand down. Thorne made his threat. I had to deliver my counter. I refused the offer, stood up, and placed a single, crisp manila folder on the table. Mr. Thorne, you mentioned regulations that don't apply to my farm size. You are correct. I am not here to talk about my farm. I am here to talk about yours. The legal reveal, Section 4B. The very next day, my legal team filed the federal complaint. It wasn't filed against Greg Wallace or the AMS Organic Program. That would have been fighting the symptom. It was filed against AgriCorp Incorporated and the USDA Farm Service Agency, FSA, the department responsible for administering commodity subsidies. The central pillar of the complaint was not pesticide drift, but the violation of the 1938 Price Stabilization and Regional Resource Act, Section 4B. The complaint detailed the forensic evidence we had collected. Soil erosion data, using side-by-side satellite imagery and soil core samples, we proved that AgriCorp's monoculture and lack of windbreaks resulted in topsoil loss far exceeding the resource preservation standards set forth in the 1938 Act. Water table contamination. Dr. Sharma's comprehensive testing demonstrated sustained, high-level nitrate and phosphate runoff into the regional water table, a clear violation of the Water Table Stability Clause. Bad faith and malice. We included the security camera footage of AgriCorp's team attempting the fake chemical spill, proving their intent to destroy me financially and reputationally, thereby illustrating a pattern of market destabilization tactics, a practice the 1938 Act was explicitly designed to prevent. When AgriCorp's lawyers received the complaint, the shock must have been absolute. The sheer audacity of using an 87-year-old, forgotten law against a multimillion-dollar corporation was unheard of. They probably laughed until they read the penalty section. Knowledge nugget number 4, the non-discretionary penalty. Unlike many modern environmental laws which allow agencies discretion in setting fines, the 1938 Price Stabilization Act's penalties related to resource misuse were mandatory and non-discretionary. This means a judge cannot choose to simply fine the company a small sum. The law unequivocally demands the full and immediate reimbursement, clawback, of all federal commodity stabilization payments received since the date of the initial violation. This removed any possibility of a quick settlement or a slap on the wrist. The hearing, igniting the $70 million bomb. The federal judge, a stern but highly respected authority named Judge Harrison, allowed for an emergency summary judgment hearing due to the scale of the financial claim and the age of the statute involved. The courtroom was packed. AgriCorp's lawyers were visibly shaken. Their defense was simple. The 1938 Act is obsolete. They argued that modern environmental protection laws superseded it, and that its resource standards were vague and unenforceable in the 21st century. Their lead counsel, Mr. Davies, concluded, "Your Honor, this is a ridiculous attempt by a disgruntled farmer to weaponize dusty archive materials. AgriCorp is compliant with all current environmental statutes. The 1938 Act is legally dead." Then it was my lawyer's turn. My lawyer, using the precise language I had highlighted, countered that the 1938 Act had never been repealed or superseded and, therefore, remained fully binding federal law. "Your Honor," my lawyer stated, "the Act's intent was to protect the American economy from resource depletion caused by poor stewardship. That threat is more real today than it was in 1938. The law does not concern itself with the Organic Act's fine print. It concerns itself with $70 million in federal taxpayer money provided under the explicit condition of good stewardship." We presented Lena Sharma's irrefutable data, the massive nitrate spike, the historical erosion rates. The evidence wasn't technical. It was scientific proof that AgriCorp's operations violated the foundational mandate of the law used to fund them. Judge Harrison, who had been reading the dense statute throughout the proceedings, finally looked up, his expression unreadable. He focused on Mr. Davies. "Counsel, I am not here to debate the wisdom of 1938. I am here to enforce the law as written. The Act states, and I quote, 'Violation of regional resource standards shall trigger the immediate cessation of all stabilization payments and the mandatory reimbursement of all funds received since the initial violation date.' Is it your contention that the evidence presented does not constitute a violation of the Water Table Stability Clause?" Davies sputtered, "No, Your Honor, but the severity." "The law specifies no measure of severity," the judge cut in sharply. "It specifies the violation. And the penalty is non-discretionary." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Harrison slammed his gavel down. "This court finds AgriCorp Incorporated in violation of the 1938 Price Stabilization and Regional Resource Act, Section 4(b), based on clear evidence of resource depletion and water table contamination. The penalty is mandatory." He looked directly at the AgriCorp table, where Marcus Thorne's face had gone pale gray. "AgriCorp Incorporated is hereby ordered to immediately reimburse the United States Treasury the sum of $70,345,921.14 in federal commodity stabilization payments." The sound of Thorne's desperate gasp was the loudest thing in the room. I had opened the dam, and the resulting financial flood was about to drown their empire. The aftermath and the legacy secured, Patton or Surakshit Virasat. The collapse of an empire. Judge Harrison's gavel strike echoed in the courtroom, but its true resonance was felt in the stock market and in the executive suites of AgriCorp. The ruling of a mandatory $70 million clawback wasn't just a legal defeat, it was a financial death blow. Marcus Thorne, who had sneered at my toxic farm, now looked like a man who had seen his entire empire dissolve before his eyes. The news broke like a dam. Financial news outlets immediately picked up on the story. Obscure 1938 Act triggers massive USDA subsidy clawback against AgriCorp. Their stock plummeted 25% in a single trading day. Investors, spooked by the sudden, unprecedented liability and the public outcry against their ecologically destructive practices, began a mass exodus. AgriCorp's carefully constructed image of agricultural innovation crumbled under the weight of an 87-year-old truth. Within weeks, their lines of credit were frozen. Major banks, which had eagerly financed their expansion, pulled their support, citing unforeseen and substantial regulatory risk. The $70 million repayment to the USDA was only the beginning. The collapse triggered a domino effect. Smaller suppliers demanded immediate payment, commodity contracts were cancelled, and their acquisition deals for other farms evaporated. Marcus Thorne, the ruthless CEO who had tried to buy me out, faced the wrath of his own board. Shareholder lawsuits piled up, accusing him of gross negligence for failing to foresee such a catastrophic legal vulnerability. The aggressive growth strategy he championed had, instead, led to cataclysmic ruin. Last I heard, he resigned in disgrace, leaving behind a company teetering on the brink of Chapter 7 bankruptcy, a complete liquidation. His private jet, once a symbol of his power, was among the first assets seized by creditors. The fall of AgriCorp was swift and absolute, a stark reminder that even the largest corporations are not immune to the power of well-enforced, if forgotten, law. Their vast tracts of monoculture corn, once buzzing with massive machinery, now stood quiet, their future uncertain. The bureaucrats' reckoning. And then there was Greg Wallace, the USDA inspector who had been AgriCorp's willing puppet. His meticulous, petty harassment campaign against me suddenly looked less like strict enforcement and more like calculated abuse of power. The federal court's ruling didn't just expose AgriCorp's violations, it indirectly highlighted the complicity of the very agency meant to oversee such issues. Within days of the clawback judgment, Wallace was placed on immediate administrative leave. The formal notice stated pending a full federal investigation into potential misconduct, conflicts of interest, and dereliction of duty regarding the enforcement of federal agricultural statutes. The phrase dereliction of duty was a polite way of saying he had deliberately ignored AgriCorp's violations of the 1938 Act, likely to protect his corporate allies. The investigation uncovered what I had always suspected, a pattern of cozy relationships with AgriCorp executives, thinly disguised gifts, and documented instances where Wallace had actively suppressed reports of environmental damage on AgriCorp's land. The trace pesticide residue on my organic farm, which he had used to revoke my certification, was revealed as a convenient smokescreen to distract from the far more egregious and systemic violations occurring next door. The state prosecutor's office, emboldened by the federal ruling and the public's outrage, initiated criminal proceedings. Wallace wasn't just looking at losing his job, He was facing charges for official misconduct and potentially aiding and abetting an ecological fraud. The man who once held my livelihood in his hands was now facing a future behind bars, his badge and bureaucratic power stripped away. Justice, in this case, wasn't just about money, it was about accountability. The restoration of Ironwood Creek Farm. With AgriCorp in ruins and Wallace facing legal woes, the immediate pressure on Ironwood Creek Farm vanished. The USDA, clearly trying to save face and demonstrate that it could uphold its own integrity, moved swiftly. My organic certification was not just reinstated, it was done with a formal apology from a higher-ranking AMS official, citing an egregious administrative error compounded by a biased investigation. It wasn't just the certificate, it was the public acknowledgement that I had been wronged. The land that AgriCorp had plundered, the 10,000 acres of monoculture, was eventually sold off. The primary buyer was not another corporate giant, but a consortium of state land trusts and a university agricultural research program. Their goal was ambitious, to restore the degraded soil, reintroduce native prairie grasses, and establish diversified, sustainable farming practices. They approached me. My farm, Ironwood Creek, suddenly became a symbol. My knowledge of heirloom seeds, soil health, and sustainable practices, once dismissed as quaint, was now invaluable. I was appointed as a senior consultant for the massive restoration project, tasked with guiding the ecological recovery of the entire valley. It was a poetic justice. The very land that AgriCorp sought to destroy was now being healed, guided by the principles they scorned. My crops flourished. The soil, free from the incessant chemical drift, slowly began to breathe again. My loyal buyers, who had stood by me during the revocation, returned, and new customers, inspired by the story of a small farmer's defiance, flocked to Ironwood Creek. Our sales soared. My family's legacy, once threatened, was now more secure and celebrated than ever. Knowledge nugget number 5. Long-term ecological recovery. Soil and water table degradation from monoculture and excessive chemical use can take decades to reverse. However, with dedicated efforts in reforestation, cover cropping, and biological amendments, combined with the reintroduction of biodiversity, significant progress can be made. The legal victory for Ironwood Creek Farm created a real-world opportunity for large-scale ecological restoration, demonstrating that legal victories can lead to tangible environmental benefits. The legacy secured and the future seeded. The legal fees and penalties exacted from AgriCorp weren't just returned to the government. A significant portion was allocated to a new USDA program specifically created to educate farmers on the importance of the 1938 Act and other historical resource preservation statutes. My legal team, satisfied with the victory, charged a reasonable fee, allowing me to do something truly meaningful. With a portion of my earnings from the settlement, Sarah and I established the Carter Regional Resource Integrity Fund. Its mission was twofold: to provide legal aid to small farmers facing similar corporate harassment and to fund scholarships for students pursuing sustainable agriculture and environmental law. We wanted to empower future generations with the knowledge and tools to fight for the land. My great-grandfather's words, scribbled in his old journal, echoed in my mind: the land remembers. And the law remembers. The drone footage I now capture shows not just my thriving organic fields, but the vast, healing landscape around it. A tapestry of diverse crops, native grasslands, and sparkling, clean streams. The sound of children on field trips, learning about heirloom seeds and the importance of healthy soil, has replaced the distant rumble of AgriCorp's chemical sprayers. My farm, once a target, is now a testament. A testament to resilience, to the power of history, and to the unwavering truth that sometimes, the most effective weapon against corporate greed is a dusty federal statute, written by honest farmers in 1938, quietly waiting to be invoked. The fight was brutal, but the harvest of justice was bountiful. The legacy of Ironwood Creek Farm, and the principles it stands for, is now secured, truly, from soil to table. The new dawn, a blueprint for resilience, Nei Suba, Lechilapan Ka Kaka. Forging new alliances, beyond the farm gate. The legal battle against AgriCorp had done more than just save Ironwood Creek Farm. It had ignited a spark. Suddenly, small farmers across the nation, many facing similar pressures from industrial agriculture and bureaucratic overreach, had a voice. My story became a blueprint for resilience, a testament to the power of knowledge, and a stark warning to those who believed they were above the law. The state land trusts and the University Agricultural Research Program, now the proud owners of the former AgriCorp lands, recognized the unique opportunity. They didn't just want to restore the land. They wanted to create a model. I was honored to be appointed to the steering committee, not just as a consultant, but as a visionary partner in what we now called the Ironwood Valley Restoration Project. This project became a living laboratory. We began by reintroducing native perennial cover crops to stabilize the eroded topsoil, a practice AgriCorp had vehemently avoided. Miles of hedgerows, once ripped out for vast monoculture fields, were replanted to encourage biodiversity and natural pest control. The contaminated waterways, which Dr. Sharma's team had meticulously documented, were undergoing bioremediation, using specialized plants and natural filters to cleanse the water table. Our collaboration extended beyond environmental recovery. We formed a cooperative of local small farmers, providing them with access to shared processing facilities, distribution networks, and most importantly, collective legal counsel. Many of these farmers had faced Greg Wallace-type inspectors or veiled threats from larger corporations. Our cooperative offered a shield, ensuring that no single farmer would ever again stand alone against overwhelming power. This was about more than just farming. It was about community building and collective empowerment. Knowledge nugget number 6, the power of cooperatives. Agricultural cooperatives, though historically significant, have seen a resurgence as small and medium-sized farms seek to compete with large industrial operations. They provide shared resources, collective bargaining power, and mutual support, acting as crucial bulwarks against economic and regulatory pressures. The USDA itself encourages the formation of such groups through various grant programs. Educating the Future, the Carter Fund, and beyond. Sarah and I understood that our victory wouldn't mean anything if the lessons learned weren't passed on. The Carter Regional Resource Integrity Fund, established with a portion of the settlement, quickly grew. Its primary focus was education and legal empowerment. We launched a series of workshops for farmers, teaching them not just about organic practices, but about understanding property rights, environmental regulations, and crucially, how to research historical federal statutes. These workshops weren't about confrontation. They were about proactive protection. We brought in experts in environmental law and agricultural economics, sharing knowledge that had previously been hidden behind paywalls or buried in obscure archives. Our scholarship program, designed for students pursuing sustainable agriculture and environmental law, became immensely popular. We sought out young minds who were passionate about the land but also understood the critical role of legal and economic frameworks. We wanted to train the next generation of Ben Carters, farmers and lawyers who could fight for ecological justice, not just in the fields, but in the courtrooms and legislative halls. One of our first scholarship recipients, a sharp young woman named Maria, came from a family farm facing immense pressure from a new housing development. She used her scholarship to study property rights and zoning laws, eventually helping her community navigate complex legal challenges and protect their agricultural land. Stories like Maria's became the true measure of our victory. The USDA, under new leadership, a direct consequence of the AgriCorp scandal, also took significant steps. They established a new historical statute review board, explicitly tasked with examining older, underutilized federal laws for their relevance in modern resource management and economic stabilization. Greg Wallace's downfall, ironically, forced the USDA to rediscover parts of its own forgotten mandate. A broader narrative, soil to table, law to legacy. Ironwood Creek Farm transcended its identity as just a farm. It became a symbol. Journalists, documentarians, and even policy makers visited, eager to understand how an old law had brought down a giant. I spoke at national agricultural conferences, not as a defiant rebel, but as an advocate for responsible stewardship and the equitable enforcement of law. My message was simple. The future of food security, ecological health, and rural economies lies in understanding the deep connection between soil, law, and community. We cannot allow short-term profit motives to override long-term planetary health. The USDA's original narrative, from its founding in 1862 to the sweeping reforms of the 1930s, was about protecting both the producer and the fundamental resources that sustain life. This narrative, from soil to table, law to legacy, became the mantra for our new movement. The landscapes around Ironwood Creek are changing. The monotonous green of monoculture is slowly giving way to a vibrant mosaic of diversified crops, restored wetlands, and native forests. The air smells cleaner, and the water flows clearer. The buzz of pollinators, once muted by chemicals, has returned, a testament to nature's incredible capacity for recovery when given a chance. Sarah and I often walk the fields in the evening, hand in hand, just as my great-grandparents must have done. The setting sun paints the sky in hues of orange and purple, reflecting off the healthy, rich soil. We see young farmers, energetic and hopeful, tending their diverse crops, empowered by knowledge and protected by a renewed commitment to justice. The everlasting harvest. The battle against AgriCorp was not just my story. It was a story for every small farmer, every environmental advocate, and every citizen who believes in the power of truth and justice. It proved that sometimes, the most potent weapons are not new technologies or lobbying dollars, but the forgotten wisdom enshrined in old laws, waiting to be rediscovered and wielded by those with the courage to do so. The legacy of Ironwood Creek Farm, once measured in heirloom tomatoes and organic certification, is now measured in restored ecosystems, empowered communities, and a renewed commitment to the principles that founded the very department that once sought to silence us. We are not just growing food, we are growing a future, rooted in the deep, fertile soil of historical integrity and ecological justice. And that, I believe, is the most bountiful harvest of all. The ripple effect, policy, precedent, and protest precedent. The Carter AgriCorp ruling, the Carter v. AgriCorp ruling, did not just mandate a clawback. It established a powerful legal precedent that shook the foundations of commodity finance across the country. AgriCorp's legal team, despite their catastrophic loss at the summary judgment level, attempted a frantic appeal, arguing that the 1938 Price Stabilization and Regional Resource Act was unconstitutionally vague and unfairly superseded by modern statutes like the Clean Water Act and the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, FIFRA. Their argument was swiftly and decisively dismissed. The appellate judge underscored Judge Harrison's initial finding. The 1938 Act was not a regulatory statute like the others. It was a contractual condition tied directly to the receipt of federal funds. The government has the right to attach conditions to its subsidies, and AgriCorp, by accepting millions in stabilization payments, had implicitly agreed to those stringent resource stewardship terms. The judgment clarified a critical point in agricultural law. Federal subsidies come with fundamental, historic obligations to the land itself. The immediate fallout was immense. Major agricultural lenders began immediately reviewing the practices of their large corporate clients who were heavy subsidy recipients. They understood that collateral was suddenly at risk if a farmer, any farmer, could successfully prove systemic violation of the 1938 Act. Lending practices, once focused purely on yield and acreage, were now forced to integrate ecological risk assessment into their due diligence. This shift in the financial landscape achieved more genuine change in corporate farming practices in 6 months than decades of environmental activism had accomplished. Policy shift, the Soil and Stability Clause within the USDA. The Carter case initiated a full-scale policy reckoning. The new administration, keen to distance itself from the corruption exposed by the Greg Wallace scandal, created the Resource Integrity and Historical Compliance Task Force. I was invited to speak before the task force multiple times, detailing how easily the system had been gamed by Wallace and how profoundly effective the 1938 Act was when simply enforced. The task force's recommendation led to a monumental, yet simple, change. A new, mandatory disclosure, often dubbed the Soil and Stability Clause, was added to all future federal stabilization payment applications. This clause required recipients to explicitly acknowledge their full compliance with all historical USDA resource preservation statutes, including the 1938 Act. While the law hadn't changed, the awareness of the law, and the liability, changed everything. Furthermore, the USDA quietly implemented changes to its inspection protocols. Inspectors were no longer solely focused on chemical use quotas or basic zoning. New training emphasized long-term ecological health indicators, such as aggregate stability, water infiltration rates, and carbon sequestration. Ben's fight had redefined what the USDA considered compliance, shifting the focus from meeting the bare minimum of modern regulation to upholding the deep responsibility of land stewardship. The most profound change was the creation of a new Ombudsman Office for Resource Integrity. This office was designed to be a firewall, offering small farmers a direct, confidential channel to report suspected corporate violations of historical resource laws without having to first face local, potentially compromised, inspectors. It was the institutionalization of the justice I had fought for. The protest and the movement, the victory galvanized the grassroots agricultural movement. Farmers who had previously felt isolated and powerless realized they were armed with a potent legal tool. The story spread through rural communities like wildfire. Shared at co-op meetings and farmers' markets, the movement sprung up called the 1938 Alliance. This was not an anti-chemical group. It was a pro-accountability group. Its members, mostly multi-generational small farmers, began using the framework of my case to challenge destructive practices in their own regions. In Iowa, the Alliance successfully used the Water Table Stability Clause against a major hog confinement operation that was polluting the regional watershed in California. They cited the topsoil retention standards to challenge developers who were aggressively clearing native scrubland for quick, high-yield cash crops without adequate erosion control. The Alliance became a national watchdog, using transparency and legal precision rather than civil disobedience. The protest wasn't angry shouting. It was the quiet, effective filing of federally mandated paperwork. I was often invited to speak at Alliance gatherings. I didn't talk about organic farming. I talked about forensic diligence. The law is a weapon, I told them. But only if you know where the safety is and where the trigger is. You must become the expert in your opponent's vulnerabilities. Don't fight the drift. Fight the source of the funding that enables the drift. Economic rebalancing and regional health. The financial restructuring of the former AgriCorp lands, now the Ironwood Valley Restoration Project, became a case study in economic rebalancing. Instead of being controlled by one distant corporation that extracted wealth and resources, the land was broken into smaller, diversified parcels leased to dozens of new farmers focused on specialty crops, high-value hemp, and rotational grazing. This diversification dramatically increased the regional economic robustness. The profit stayed local, recirculating through local seed suppliers, equipment repair shops, and community banks. The monoculture economy of dependence was replaced by an economy of resilience. Dr. Lena Sharma, my environmental forensics expert, monitored the ecological recovery closely. She noted a measurable increase in soil carbon content on the former AgriCorp land within 2 years, a direct result of the cover cropping and reduced tillage mandated by the new lease agreements. This wasn't just good for the environment, it was a demonstrable success in the fight against climate change, proving that legal and economic enforcement of historic resource laws could have a global impact. The irony was palpable. AgriCorp's greedy attempt to destroy my small organic farm ultimately led to the largest ecological restoration and economic diversification project in the region, built directly upon the ruins of their own corporate model. My family's legacy was not just saved, it was amplified, becoming the blueprint for a healthier, more equitable future for American agriculture. The $70 million clawback wasn't just a penalty, it was the seed money for the new, sustainable dawn. The enduring testament, Antim Praman. The unrepealable truth. The legal skirmish with AgriCorp had concluded, but the legal and ethical reverberations continue to reshape the landscape. The most profound realization stemming from the Carter v. AgriCorp ruling is the inherent unrepealability of good law. Modern politics can manipulate new regulations, insert loopholes, or soften penalties, but they rarely take the time to formally rescind the foundational statutes of a previous era. The 1938 Act was a reminder that the skeleton of justice is far harder to dismantle than the flesh of current policy. This principle is now a core tenet of the Carter Regional Resource Integrity Fund seminars. We teach farmers not just where to look, but what to value in the statute books, those laws born out of national necessity. The Depression, the World Wars, the Dust Bowl, tend to carry non-discretionary authority because failure was not an option when they were drafted. These laws are legally powerful because they are morally ironclad. They represent the collective wisdom gained from past catastrophe, and they stand as a permanent challenge to short-term greed. My final act in the legal arena was collaborating with a pro bono law firm to draft model legislation, not to create a new law, but to codify the necessity of reviewing and enforcing these historical resource statutes at the state level. The aim was to decentralize the power of the 1938 Act, ensuring that enforcement wasn't solely reliant on a federal judge in a complex subsidy case, but could be triggered more easily through local agricultural or environmental boards. This move effectively ensured that the precedent set by the clawback could be wielded by any farmer with the diligence to document their opponent's resource violations. The harvest of humility and knowledge. Stepping back from the daily legal battle allowed me to reflect on the humility that farming demands, a humility AgriCorp entirely lacked. Their failure was an arrogance, the belief that technology could conquer nature and law could conquer history. My humility was earned through the near-total loss of my legacy. That moment of despair, when Inspector Wallace revoked my organic status, was the crucial turning point. It stripped away my professional pride and forced me to become a student again. A student of history, law, and environmental forensics. The knowledge I gained in that dark period is now the greatest asset of Ironwood Creek Farm. Today, my farm is not just a commercial success. It is an educational hub. We host university classes studying agroecology and agricultural law. Students no longer just learn how to maximize yield. They learn how to maximize resilience. They learn about the fragile soil microbiome that sustains life, and they learn about the legal architecture that must be in place to protect it. We ensure they understand the deep irony. The biggest legal victory for organic and sustainable farming in decades came not from the Organic Act, but from a law designed to stabilize the price of corn and cotton during an economic collapse. It is a testament that all good resource laws are, fundamentally, soil conservation laws. Securing the true legacy. My personal victory has blossomed into a collective triumph for the entire Ironwood Valley. The former AgriCorp land is beginning to flourish under diverse management. The native windbreaks are maturing, the water quality is improving, and the land trusts are successfully demonstrating that ecological stewardship is not a cost, but a long-term investment. My family's legacy, which began with a single farmer's dedication to his plot of land, now extends far beyond the fences of Ironwood Creek. It is in the legal counsel provided to a struggling rancher 500 miles away through the Carter Fund. It is in the new, principled USDA protocols. It is in the eyes of every young scholar who decides to study law, not for corporate defense, but for environmental justice. The final, lasting impact of the fight is the permanent shift in the regional mindset. The easy route, the chemical reliance, the extractive monoculture, is no longer viewed as smart business. It is viewed as high-risk liability. The sustainable, resilient path is now recognized as the only truly stable financial model, thanks to the non-discretionary penalty of the 1938 Act. I often stand on the slight rise behind my great-grandfather's old stone silo, looking out at the valley. The sky is wider now, the air cleaner, and the fields are a tapestry of green and gold diversity. The fight was brutal, but the result is a profound, enduring peace. My revenge was not personal. It was ecological and systemic. I opened the dam, and the resulting flood of justice washed away the corruption, ensuring that my family's promise to the land will be honored, not just for the next generation, but for the next century. The testament is the soil itself, rich, dark, and legally protected.